Hey guys, today we're gonna make a Jolly Bar Dresden. You're gonna love it. It's a super easy project. Now we don't have a pattern for this. It's just gonna be the video, so make sure you watch the whole video and you're gonna have a lot of fun today making this. So let's get started. Your first step is to pick 12 Jolly Bar rectangles to make your Dresden circle. So I've taken the Cozy Up collection and I've selected 12. We're gonna cut Dresdens out of all 12. And I also selected a plaid for the center. We're gonna work with this one later, so set this one aside. But what's great to do is pick your pieces, take a photo with your cell phone, so that when you come back to it, you already remember your fabric placement. So the one thing that you do have to make this is the Starburst It's So Emma ruler by Creative Grids. And what you'll wanna do is we're gonna lay this 1-inch line at the bottom and then cut on all sides. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and cut a straight line just so it's a little bit more accurate and just cut this little pinked edge off. And I did want to tell you that I did go ahead and starch all of my Jolly Bar rectangles, and I do think it's important because you have so much bias here and you're going to notice that in your next step. So go ahead and starch everything and let it dry. So you've just got the 1-inch line at the bottom, and then you just cut all the sides, and you're going to do this for all 12 Jolly Bar rectangles. And this is what your unit will look like. So go ahead and cut the remaining 11. So I have my Dresden all laid out, and remember this one's gonna be our center circle. So I'm gonna set that aside and we're just gonna remember to not cut that. And we're gonna sew this into a ring. And what I'm going to do is put 2 fabrics right sides together, and because I have starched, you're not going to have as much movement, but this is a bias, and so it is going to have a lot of bend in it. So because of that, to make this accurate, I'm going to pin at each end twice in the center. And it does seem like, oh, you don't need pins, but I promise you, after making several of these samples, you definitely need to pin. We're going to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end, stitch all the way to the end, and backstitch again. I'm also going to be using a 1.2 stitch length, super tiny, because we are going to be pressing this open. And I'm gonna lay this back here, and I'm gonna go all the way around the circle, and we're gonna do 2 at a time. We're gonna come back and then press after we have the first parts put together. So the reason we backstitch at the beginning and the end is you will see when we start building this, we will be turning fabric inside out, and you don't want your stitches to come out. So from here, this is kind of how it's looking. Now I'm going to show you how we will press these units before we add the next pieces together. From here, I'm going to set my seam by just placing my iron on this nice and flat. Let it sit there about 5 seconds. Then press to one side. And I'm going to put the crease of the iron right on that. Let that sit about 5 seconds. And then we're going to press open, run the iron over the crease. And then I'll just put my clapper here. That's gonna absorb the heat and make it nice and flat, and I'm gonna continue to do the remainder of these units. I laid this back out in my circle, and if you separate, you'll see that this is one half and this is another half. So what I'm going to do is stitch this half together, stop, stitch this half together, stop, press, and then come back and stitch the last 2 units. So let's do the top and the bottom half first. And now we're gonna iron the top and the bottom pieces. So we have 2 seams to iron. I would start on this bottom one, set this seam, press to one side, set the second seam, press to one side, and then press these open. So now I'm going to put these right sides together, and I'm going to pin at the edge of each within the center, and then I'm going to sew each seam. Now if you do this and you sew just like this, you're going to have a better result than if you just try to sew everything into one big circle. Now from here, I am going to clip all these little strings off just so there's no extra bulk, and then I'm going to iron this the same way I have been ironing. So when you're done, everything should lay nice and flat. You should not have big bumps inside your Dresden. So it should be flat on the front and the back. The next step is to prepare our backing. So we have chosen this fabric for our backing, and we cut a 20-inch square. We also have the Quilter's Dream Fusible 80/20 batting. On the batting is a sticker that tells you which side is fusible side. So you want the fusible side down. So I'll remove the sticker, and you can tell which side is fusible if you touch it. It's rougher. This side is softer. Whichever brand you use, make sure it is only fusible on one side. And we're going to take an iron and we're going to fuse it together. But before we do that, we're going to get everything nice and flat. And again, these are both 20-inch squares. And this is the fusible side. So if you see any of that coming up, you don't want your iron to touch it because it will ruin your iron. Just place your iron on here and just leave your iron about 10 seconds all the way across, and just take your time. You want to make sure there's no creases, and you just want to make sure that everything is fused together, because that will help you on your next step. Now that you have that done, you're going to put your batting side down, backing side up, and Dresden circle face down. Now I'm going to pin this down. We will be stitching a 1/4 inch away from the edge on all sides, so you want to make sure your pins are not going to interfere with your stitching. So I'm going to place a lot of pins so it will not shift. So from here, I put a lot in the center, and when you pick this up and move it around, it should be very flat on the back. It should be very flat on the front. You'll have to be careful because there are a lot of pins and they will poke you. I would rather get poked than be inaccurate though. So you kind of have to decide how many pins you're comfortable with. And we're going to be stitching a 1/4 inch away from the seams, and we're going to pivot right in those intersections. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to draw 1/4 inch lines on the edge of the entire thing, but it is hard when you pivot to know exactly where to pivot, and if you draw these lines, it will be more accurate. So at this point, we're going to be using a walking foot. And a walking foot is a foot that is going to pull the bottom and the top at the same time. And anytime you're working with something with batting, you're going to get better results. So I am going to use a walking foot, and I'm going to follow my lines The friction pin ink will disappear with heat later, so make sure you don't iron before you stitch on these lines. It is important in every point to pivot and have a clean pivot for when we turn this over later. Because you're going through so many layers and there's just so much going on, it's best if you have a flat surface. So we've added a bed to our sewing machine so it's nice and flat. And I'm going to be using Topstitch size 90 needles because that's going to give you a better result going through all of the layers. So before I start stitching over here, I'm going to test my stitch length. I'm going to start with a 2.0. So this is my stitch length. You'll see it's nice and tight, and the reason why is you don't want a long stitch length, or when you pivot, it's not going to be as easy. So I'm just going to start in the middle of one of the Dresdens, it doesn't matter where, and you want to have your sewing machine in the needle down position and just stitch on the lines and pivot as close to the point as you can. And if it doesn't go exactly to the point, then you can hand move the dial where it goes exactly in your drawn line. And you're going to do this all the way around your Dresden. Now we've got back to the beginning where we started our stitches. So just stitch and then go about 1 inch over your previous stitches. So you've sewn all the way around, and now I'm going to pull the pins out, and on the back it should be nice and flat, and you can just make sure there's no pins. So from here I'm going to cut right on the edge of the Dresden. And at this point, you can iron the friction pin lines out if you want, but since we're gonna do an overall press at the end, they're gonna come out in that step, so it's up to you. So from here, I'm gonna just use long bladed scissors and first just cut all the way around the outside. On each tip, we're going to cut a little top off. You want to be about a 1/16 of an inch away from the stitch. So you're going to do that. And then I'm going to cut a little bit off here also. And that's going to remove the bulk so that the point can be nice when we get to it. So I'm going to do that first, and then we're going to cut in here in a second. So we're going to do the same thing in the V. We're going to just cut a tiny bit out so that this can turn nice. So now we're going to turn this inside out, and you're going to see that's why we backstitch, so that these stitches don't start falling out. And it's going to get wrinkled, but we're going to iron it and it'll get all fixed. But what you want to do is just pull a tiny bit out at a time. Now I'm going to use a point turner. So for here, you want to make sure you don't push through your fabric. I'm actually going to use this side to start, and you'll just push so that your seam allowance is flat and the curved side is less likely to poke out, and you just kind of maneuver where everything is going to be nice and flat. So from here, you're just going to use your iron and get everything nice and flat. I have turned the steam off so it doesn't get too wrinkly. Now you don't need to worry about the center because we're going to put a circle over the center. So from here, you just want to get everything nice and flat because we're going to quilt this down. On the top, you want to see only the orange, not the white. So you want to tuck this in and just iron. And if any of your points don't look sharp enough, you can use this. I have moved my stitch length to a 3.0 since I think the quilting looks better at a longer stitch. I'm going to find a guide on my walking foot to follow, and I'm going to start in the center, go out around each petal and back. And I'm going to do that on each petal, and when I'm done, I'll show you how it looks. I'm not going to cut my thread as I go around because you will see that on the back. Now we're going to work on the circle that goes in the center of your Dresden, and I'm going to use the 4.5-inch circle from the Rotary Cutting Circle Ruler set from Creative Grids. It has lots of circles, but I'm going to use the 4.5-inch size. But you don't have to use this. You can just get a mug from your house that's just a wide mouth and kind of, about 4.5 inches around. But I'm going to use this circle. I'm going to use the Sew and Interfacing by Lori Holt that's non-fusible. I'm going to just draw this circle with a friction pen because it will disappear with heat later. And I'm going to put this on top of my fabric that is used for the center. And you can kind of see the design, so you can move it around. I'm going to try to get the check in the center, and to do that, I'm going to fold this in fourths and try to center this. I'm going to pin this in place. We're going to go back to that open toe foot and a 1.5 stitch length, and we're just going to stitch all the way around the circle, and I'll be back right after I do that. Now I'm going to cut about 1/8 of an inch around the outside of the circle. And so your circle will turn nice when you flip it inside out. You can cut little V's. So from here, just separate your fabric and your interfacing. Clip a hole. And then I'm just going to use my finger and run it across the edge. More of those little clips you put, the easier this is going to turn around. And the straighter you sewed on the line, the nicer your circle is going to come out. So here I'm going to press this down so it's nice and flat. Here's how my circle looks, and on the back you want it to look like this where it's not all torn open because this interfacing is keeping the shape. What I'm going to do here is fold it in fourths to find the center. I'm going to get the top of my Dresden and I'm going to line up these with these lines so it's centered. So this line across and this line, and that gets it right in the center. So you can see my creases matched up here and my creases matched up here. And what I'm going to do is pin this in place and put the walking foot back on my machine and just stitch around in a circle, and I'm going to do the longer 3.0 stitch length. When you're working with a circle like this, if you keep your left hand and you just rotate your hand as you go, that's going to give you a nice stitch. And I did back stitch at the beginning and the end, and I'll just clip this little thread. I know exactly where this Jolly Bar Dresden is going in my house. These make quick gifts and it only takes an hour. So pick up a Jolly Bar at Fat Quarter Shop and have fun sewing. Subscribe to our channel and I'll see you next time.